Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining for today's live session on conquering 2023 supply chain setbacks. I'm Colleen Zupan, Director of Business Development here at GEP, and we're responsible for our consulting and managed services lines of business. I've been working with many of our oil and gas customers over the last few years. Today, I'm joined by supply chain leader Sasha Sergeev. Now, to introduce you to Sasha is a supply chain professional with over 20 years of diverse international experience in oil and gas industry in various roles with Shell, Husky Energy, and Cenovus Energy. He's developed and implemented a number of supply chain organizational transformation projects. And Sasha is a passionate, people-focused leader with over 15 years of experience leading diverse multicultural teams across the globe. He's a forward-looking proponent of new digital SCM technology and tools as enablers to make supply chain a competitive differentiator for the business. He's a fellow at Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply and a member of the Supply Chain Canada Association, where he was named to the list of Canadian immigrants impacting supply chain in 2020. Sasha, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Colleen. Hopefully you can see me. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and looking forward to the lively conversation and to answering questions.
Great. I do want to take a few minutes just to share a couple of things prior to getting started so the audience knows what to expect. We'll be having a discussion and interchange of ideas with Sasha for a little over a half an hour, and then we'll dive into questions and answers. So please do feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat and we'll address them. With that said, let's kick off our session. To me, it seems like every day when you turn on the news, the topic of supply chain continues to pop up. We all know that supply chain management is growing increasingly complex. Even as the acute phase of the pandemic ends in much of the world, the pressures of legislation and geopolitical tensions, supply chain challenges, inflationary pressure, and labor continues. In this environment, there's a clear need for organizations to improve their supply chain and procurement strategies to combat supply disruptions. Sasha, we all know that the global supply chain is under pressure from a variety of angles, from plant shutdowns, economic sanctions on Russia, labor and material shortages, just to name a few. What are some of the key strategies companies should leverage to build supply chain resilience?
Yeah, Colleen, I think resiliency is one of these very interesting topics, and it's one way, in my opinion, to differentiate great supply chain teams from not so great supply chain teams. And what I can say is that over the last few years with pandemic, but even before that and ongoing right now, we're going through the time. Well, I can say that in my 20 years working in supply chain, I haven't seen anything to that magnitude in terms of all the different disruptions that we've faced and supply chain professionals have faced. And typically in the past, we would have a one-off event and we would deal with it. But over the recent years, it's been just one after another, these disruptions in different sectors. Of course, the pandemic with a huge impact on top of it. I think pretty much every industry and every team has been impacted. And from what we can say, that this will continue. This is set to continue. It's not like we will come out of it and we'll go back to the normal. Those disruptions will continue for many, many reasons: climatic, geopolitical, social, etc., etc. So resiliency, in my opinion, will remain the topic and will remain the point of differentiation. Teams that have resiliency and build resiliency in their supply chains are able to go through the business disruptions without impacting their operations, without impacting the business that they support. And on the contrary, companies who don't have resiliency in their supply chains, they tend to be reactive, tend to sort of try to make decisions on a dime, always backpedaling, always responding to what's happening around them. So in order to build the resiliency, I think there's two main factors. So one, you need to increase your knowledge and intelligence about the external environment. And then from that, also the second part is building flexibility into your supply chain solutions. So if we unpack this a little bit, so on the external environment and intelligence around that, you can do this by building your own market intelligence capabilities within your team, with your own team, by scanning environment, or you can tap into a lot of external knowledge. The service providers are there that can help you to do that if you don't have internal capacity. So that is the prerequisite, because if you know what's happening, if you can anticipate what's happening in the environment, this will allow you to respond in a better way. And then in terms of flexibility, building flexibility in your process, I think, again, nothing overly complicated. It all starts with understanding the structure of your supply chains. And unfortunately, not many companies really know what's happening in their supply chains beyond that first tier level, your immediate suppliers, your immediate service providers. But the trick is that these disruptions are typically coming not from the first level, but from the levels below that, the second, third, and fourth tier, and so on in your supply chain. So your ability to get ahead of the disruption is to really understand what's happening in your supply chain beyond the first level. So understanding, mapping your supply chain is very, very important. And then once you know that, I think a very common sense solution that in many cases I've seen myself firsthand and sort of in other examples is that having deep supply relationship, building and cherishing supply relationship, or especially with those suppliers who are critical and sub-suppliers who are critical to your supply chain, can help you prevent and get ahead of many of these things. So that's probably what I would say in terms of resilience.
Sasha, I mean, some really good points. I mean, obviously understanding the environment around you and tapping into market intelligence certainly be useful. And then understanding what's coming down the pipeline for your suppliers so that you can combat that and be flexible. Really good points. Just to maybe you could add and build onto that in a bit more. So in what ways, can these practices be sustainable? And any other additional strategies that you can think that firms should employ?
Yeah, so if we think in terms of what's been happening, especially over the sort of recent couple of years, we've seen inflation going up, and that has been impacting a lot of businesses, and supply chain teams are the ones in many cases sort of facing this at the front of the battle. So what we have seen and likely will continue to see for a short period until sort of inflation will be curbed back, which will happen at some point, but may not happen as fast, or may not happen across the world in sort of a similar manner. We'll see supply chain teams needing to continue to respond to price increases from suppliers, renegotiating contracts. There's what's been happening, and what you can say is happening in the market right now in many ways, that the buyers have lost the leverage on the market, and the suppliers have gained a lot of leverage. So that has been the name of the game, and it's been very complex and very challenging for supply chain teams, and they've been doing their best, right? And again, those who have intelligence in terms of what they're buying, what's the cost structure, having some intelligence and having intelligence in sort of categories and negotiations, those are typically better off. Those who have closer supplier relationships typically better off, because it's in the transactional relationship where you being leveraged, where the suppliers typically feed off the clients. in a more strategic partnering relationship, you typically don't see that. But what I wanted to say is that the trend will likely change, right? The tide will change, and what we will see likely is that the projection is that, at least in certain parts of the global economy, the recession will start to settle in. And with the recessionary environment, there will be a different mindset that will be required from the supply chain team. So for example, to mitigate some of these supply disruptions and higher prices, some of the teams have been buying more, or they've been increasing their stock levels. Those behaviors will have to change in the opposite direction, right? Is that you will want to capture the opportunities in the market, and it's interesting to see how not many companies apply sort of an intelligent way to doing this. What I've seen multiple times through the cycle is those blanket requests to suppliers. Hey, we're expecting a certain rate reduction decrease, and that's typically how things are being addressed. But a more intelligent way, which is premised on tracking which commodities and which services are sort of projected to decrease in pricing, and capturing that and going after those specific cost factors in your price base with your suppliers, is typically yielding much more sustainable results, as what you've been asking, Colleen. I wanted to talk about another trend, which is absolutely noticeable, and that is sort of a shift from sort of offshoring, outsourcing, going after the lowest cost, which we've seen over the years sort of as a trend in many supply chains and many industries. Now a little bit reversing into sort of nearshoring. Companies realizing that having all of their eggs in one basket with offshore Asian suppliers can be painful, and they've seen this and experienced that through the sort of pandemic and Pacific logistic route congestion. So they looking at solutions where they can balance between offshoring and nearshoring. That increases resiliency, may be impacting prices a little bit in the opposite direction, but I think hopefully with China opening up, with the change in the COVID regulations, although it will be still quite turbulent with the impact of COVID in China on the factories and the availability of production there, I think over time this is actually a way for us to get the economy going back, and then offshoring will continue to go. This dismantling of offshore sort of longer supply chain will not happen overnight. It will take a lot of time. It will be more of a small adjustment, in my opinion, than the big shift.
Yeah. Sasha, thank you for that. I appreciate you calling out that trend and that shift that you're seeing, bringing things near shore. Certainly something that we're seeing as well. So, okay, we talked a little bit about inflation and how that has caused maybe some unnecessary spend. However, with energy demands continuing to increase and renewables only able to help with a fraction of the demand, we'll be relying on oil and gas for a while to come. There's a need to continue to invest in capacity. Chesapeake Energy, for instance, has doubled their capacity or their capital spend to $1.5 billion last year, and has opened their 7th drilling rig in the Haynesville Basin. With capital projects continuing to be a priority, I'm curious, how do you see companies mitigating the supply chain and inflation risks for CapEx projects?
Yeah, so CapEx projects and so supply chain solutions for it, it's what I would call it's a little bit of a different beast from your day-to-day operational supply chain. So some different rules of the game come in, and some different trends as well. Let me talk about just more in general what different approaches companies take in terms of managing capital spend, capital procurement, and supply chain. So you can go different ways. So one of the ways is that if you don't have your own supply chain team for projects, or it's very slim, and you have a certain capital project or investment that you have, if it's a one-off nature, you can definitely, and that's a typical in sort of energy and oil and gas. You can go to the engineering contractors, and they help you not just with the design, but they also have the capabilities for procurement and managing material purchases, and even managing the construction contracts. But another way to go here, and it's typically when you have a critical mass, when you have enough projects or capital spend, or portfolio projects, where you probably can already start building your own capital projects, CapEx procurement team. And there are certain benefits on both sides, but the benefit in having your own team, once you have a critical mass, once you have a project portfolio, this is coming where you start integrating and with your own sort of procurement processes, procurement systems, your sourcing capabilities, and also you can take into account the leverage of that program, the leverage of the total company spend. So that can yield some value, rather than sort of a transactional one-off sort of procurement through the engineering companies. But then let's get into the second part. What you've asked, Colleen, was around the way to mitigate risks, or the value you can capture there. And building on what I was saying in the previous answer, in the capital projects environment, this is where you have an opportunity to go with the market and to leverage the changes in the market. Because typically in your projects, you do have a choice, unless like in the project, in operations, sort of day-to-day supply chain, where you constantly buy, right? You constantly need to feed the sort of operations and maintenance machine. In the capital projects, you typically have certain flexibility in terms of timing of purchases. And this is where the opportunity comes in. The opportunity is that you can time your purchases, especially your major purchases or purchases of items tied to major commodities, where you can track, again, what commodities influence the price, and you can buy early and in bulk, so buy ahead when the prices are on the rise, what we've seen in an inflationary situation. But then in the recession, you can delay the purchases to, again, time the market perfectly so that you get the most optimum value. So that's probably one of the recommendations I would have for managing the capital spend.
Great. No, that's really great, Sasha. Thank you. So, with the swells in demand and rising material costs, oil and gas companies have been thoughtful in really applying artificial intelligence to daily operations. For example, BP has invested in AI to simulate scenarios that can impact upstream functions, to which turn is driving more evidence-based decisions. In what ways do you think companies should be taking advantage of AI and its ability to really convey operational inefficiencies?
Yeah, so obviously AI has been sort of a buzzword, right? Artificial intelligence has been a buzzword lately. I think everyone is catching up to the hype of chat bots, and chat GPT has been an interesting thing to observe over the last few months. And this area will continue to mature. I think that's my opinion, is that it will continue to mature, and the capabilities will become as such that they will be usable. Because up until recently, I think typically you see these trends come in and there's a lot of buzz, but the practicalities of the use can be questionable and can be challenging for practitioners on the ground in doing the day-to-day work. But I think as the technology advances, as the trend advances, you can start seeing sort of the noise is being weeded out and the practical application starts to come out. and blockchain went through the same sort of buzz, and now I think it's settling into something much more usable. But let's go back to the artificial intelligence and machine learning. So companies in oil and gas in general, if we look at the industry, they're already using these applications. They use them in sort of reservoir management, so to manage the flow of oil and gas as they extract them. They use them in plant operations and maintenance for the predictive maintenance. So these solutions are already there and being used by many, many companies in the industry. And they're being used because they add value. When we talk specifically about supply chain, these solutions are also starting to come into the picture. And I'll name just a few examples where I've seen them being used and used effectively and with some practical sort of benefits. So one is in the logistics management. So think of Uber, right, as an application with artificial intelligence built into it. The same things would apply. The same sort of use case would apply in terms of your scheduling of logistics and logistics run, route optimization, load optimization, so that you run full, and then backhauls as well. So the opportunity in sort of optimizing the use of trucks going empty back. The other one, which I think will get traction more and more, depending on the maturity of supply chain, is around demand management. So unfortunately, many procurement teams are way too responsive, and then they sort of focus on purchasing whatever is sort of being requested in the moment. And having an ability to use the machine learning and artificial intelligence to help with managing the demand, predicting the demand, because in many, many ways and many, many organizations, there are patterns which it's hard to see for a human, but the machine can pick up those patterns and help you to time and optimize those purchases. I think these solutions are already being used and will continue to be sort of expanded and used. And then you're managing your procure to pay process. So there's a lot of transactions which many organizations facing in terms of sort of purchase orders, requisitions, payments, where artificial intelligence and machine learning and I think robotic process automations is already there, and there's so many easy to use applications which help you to be more efficient with how you deal with procure to pay transactions, but also replace some of this sort of low skilled transactions from humans to the machine. They can just execute this. But I wanted to pick up on something which I think is a trend of what I'm seeing, and that is there's a lot of opportunities, as we talked about. Yes, the sort of the buzz is still there. There's a lot of opportunities with these modern technologies coming into sort of the day-to-day. But what I see in energy and oil and gas is that not many companies are capturing those opportunities or getting ready to capture. And the reasons behind this, I would say, is there's one fundamental thing which many companies, I think, miss and need to adjust. And that is, yes, so the tools will come in and they will be practical, they will be so easy to use, and the capabilities will be there. But it's not just the technology, it's not just the knowledge of how to use the technology that you will need, but you actually need to have a different mindset. And that mindset of data-centric mindset, master data, having the right, understanding that the data is the key to actually being able to use those tools and to get value from them. And unfortunately, it's just rare to see that companies really paying attention and really adopting that data-centric concept and understanding that before you start using these wonderful tools and before you can get value from it, you really need to have the right data, clean data, accurate data, reflect all your physical transactions with the digital data points in your systems. That will have to change. Otherwise, all of these capabilities will not be realized.
I mean, Sasha, there was a lot packed in there, from demand management and really helping to have better predictability to changing the mindset and being more data centric. I think there's a lot to give everyone to think about when it comes to how to use AI and what should be used within their own organizations. We're going to switch gears just a little bit to a trend that has been in the news in just about every industry, and that's around quiet quitting. And it really continues to prevail around all industries, with demotivated workers dedicating less and less effort to the daily tasks. And then this, coupled with workforce retention issues and resiliency to reskilling, it's really proven to especially be problematic in oil and gas due to the constant dynamic business challenges that really require reliable staffing. How can leaders in oil and gas combat the concerns and reduce attrition?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and it's actually, you can see this through sort of what's percolating on LinkedIn amongst the supply chain professionals and supply chain leaders. That's on many people's minds and on many leaders' minds. And again, let's go back to where we talked, what we talked about in the beginning, is that the amount of disruption and change has been unprecedented. That impacted the supply chain teams. The asks on the supply chains have been continued to grow, and it's predicted to be growing as well in the future. But I think one of the things that people don't realize, that the amount of work and the asks are growing, but the resourcing levels, the sort of the levels of resourcing of the supply chains in the organizations have not necessarily been growing at the same level, have not been catching up. So in my opinion, one of the key reasons for this dilemma, for high levels of attrition, for people leaving and quitting and moving elsewhere, has been just the lack of resourcing, being overworked. People are quitting because they had at some point they had enough. There's a whole discussion around widespread of burnout in procurement teams. More and more people talk about this sort of on LinkedIn and in sort of more sort of discussions, networking discussions, because again, I think it's reaching the levels where the amount of work is just more than what people can do. So, in my opinion, this will have to be addressed, and hopefully will be addressed by those teams who want to keep people, because we keep talking about this, is that supply chain procurement is a people business. You're only as good as the people you have, because if you have great professionals on your team and you're able to keep and retain them, then you're able to achieve the results far better than your competitors. But if good people are leaving, I think as any leader who had that happen to them knows the pain, knows the challenges of backfilling and recruiting and finding good professionals. So on the other side, I think it's actually an interesting point, is that for young professionals, young university students, people who are choosing the profession, there's such an opportunity. There's such a hunger for talent and young talent in supply chain all across North America. I can see this. The market is hot, and teams will be looking for these young professionals. So it's a great profession to be in. But let me jump onto something else. All right, the realities are as such that the asks on the team and the taxing of the teams is growing. It's unlikely that all the leaders in supply chain will get as many resources as they want. So what can be done? And this is where I think that there's another lever, or there's another way of how you can minimize that, and that is through the engagement. And one of the other associated reasons of why people leave, or what can make people stay, is the level of engagement. And this is where leaders step into the spotlight, and this is where leaders can make the difference. Leaders set the tone, leaders set the energy and the culture within their teams, and paying attention to the dynamic within your team, paying attention to the environment and the culture in your team can actually make the difference. And this is where, again, I think leaders, those leaders who understand this and able to put the energy into this, will typically see sort of better results. People enjoy working for good teams, in good teams. They enjoy the working in certain cultures. And sometimes this sometimes is the reason why people go, right? That's a sort of a tipping point. So practical advice for leaders. Yeah, not everyone can be that superstar, right? But there's some small things that you can do, in my opinion, which will help. One of the other things that contributes is sort of a mismatch between the skills and the role, lack of professional development, lack of attention to professional development, because many professionals actually do want to feel that they're being supported in their career and their progression. So small things like having a competency assessment framework, helping people to assess where they are, having the conversations to review that, having conversations about what's the development plan, and how can we help those who are on that professional journey to make the next step. Is it a training course? Is it a new role? Is it a stretch assignment? Doing things like this, sometimes small things like this, can make a big difference, and again, will contribute to sort of a culture and environment and team, and people will want to stay. Again, no silver bullet, but small things like this can help for sure.
I think all really good points. We do want to be heard, and having that engagement individually with your teams, I think is very important. And then having the framework in place to help them succeed and build on their professional careers, I think definitely something that we know needs to be done, but not necessarily is being acted on. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. I have just one more question that I wanted to dive into before we turn it over to our audience for their questions. And again, switching gears just a bit more, but natural disasters are obviously incredibly destructive to the oil and gas industry. Hurricane Ida, for example, shut down 80% of oil rig production in the Gulf of Mexico just 2 years ago. And this past year, Hurricane Ian shut down over 10% of oil rigs. With a global push to mitigate against such disasters, there's been a lot of talk about reducing carbon emissions. What approaches have you seen that are effective to decarbonization, and what are the steps being taken to achieve that goal?
Yeah, so Colleen, we actually have a question from Venkata along the same lines around the focus on sustainable supply chain practices in oil and gas. So I'll touch on this as I answer your question here as well. So let's talk about sort of high level picture first, and then sort of dive into the supply chain elements of this. So many oil and gas companies, I would say probably majority of oil and gas companies, are already implementing steps to decarbonize their operations and help sort of the whole climate action agenda, especially those who operate in sort of well-established economic environments with government commitments, right, on decarbonization. So I can tell you that many oil and gas companies already on that path, and they do this for multiple reasons. Some are more geared towards response to the sort of stakeholder, shareholder concerns, investors' concerns. Others, more proactive and want to sort of stay ahead. You can see that some companies and especially big multinational companies are already actively integrating renewable sources of energy into their portfolios, aggressively pursuing that. So they playing into more of a renewable sources of energy. You can also see another trend is that many companies are looking at their own operations and their own sort of assets and looking at ways of how they can mitigate and minimize what's called scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions. So scope 1 is related to your own operations, the emissions that you generate yourself in producing the product. And in oil and gas, scope 1 emissions are significant, just because of just the nature of hydrocarbon extraction and processing. So many companies are already looking at minimizing those scope 1 emissions through electrifying their operations and their assets, and through ways of capturing and storing the CO2 and other gases through the CO2 sequestration and carbon capture process. So these projects, these initiatives are already being actively pursued. There's certain number of those captures and storage facilities already operating. So now let's turn to the supply chain part of it, the sustainability in supply chain. So I'll start off by saying that supply chain teams are actually already contributing by being part of those major sort of sustainability projects within their companies. But supply chain teams have another opportunity to shine, and that is in what's called scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are the emissions which are associated with greenhouse gases through a number of means, including through the goods and services that you acquire. So all the goods and services that you acquire, what sort of the greenhouse gas emissions tail or path it leaves. And this is, as I said, supply chain teams in any industry, but in oil and gas, have a great opportunity. Because if you look at the oil and gas company, typically oil and gas company, this scope 3 emissions are actually, in many cases, will be larger than their own scope 1 emissions. It's a complex and complicated area. It's definitely something that's being discussed by supply chain professionals, and the trends show that this will continue despite all the challenges and the recession potentially looming. The ESG initiatives will continue to be a core part of business initiatives, and therefore supply chain will be involved. And many companies struggle, and many supply chains in oil and gas and actually other industries struggle. So where do they start? Like, how do you start making meaningful progress on this? And there's a number of small steps, initial steps that you can take, which are not that complicated, but can set the path and help you to go along the way. So first of all, starting with understanding your scope 3 GHG emissions levels from your supply chain. That is a simple first step that many companies can take, which can help them to understand what are we dealing with. So that requires, again, building on your supply chain mapping and building on understanding your supply chain structure and solutions, then reaching into the supply chain and collecting information. And there's a number of methods out there which you can use. Some of them are very detailed and complex. Some of them are much easier, where you can acquire information about that scope 3, at least in relative manner. And then from that, once you understand the sources and the amounts, you can also sort of, instead of trying to do everything at once, you can start focusing on the main sources, which suppliers are the main sources of your scope 3, and start working with them. In many ways, reaching into your suppliers, your key suppliers who are main sources of emissions, but just in general, and asking them a question and showing that you're interested, in my opinion, will create the ripple effect where the community and your supply chain base will start to pay attention to this point. And then you can build on top of that by including in your sourcing activities, sourcing sort of exercises, but also in the sort of day-to-day management of relationship, this topic. And then I bet many companies will be surprised that when they actually talk to their supply base, they will be surprised how much is already their suppliers are doing in this area. And they will be able to share with them some of the interesting initiatives that they're already implementing, which then the operators can take on and demonstrate that, hey, we're already working to reduce our GHG emissions, not just in our own emissions, but in the scope 3 emissions area as well.
Thank you, Sasha. We have several questions coming from our audience. Maybe we can pick a couple of those to talk through, and whoever we don't get to today, we'll reach out individually. Going back to the first kind of things that we were talking about when it comes to supply chain resilience, Vikram had asked, what can be done to make the supply chain resilient? What will be a better way to be responsive or efficient within your supply chain?
Yeah, so I think we touched on this a little bit, and one of the things to say is that for the longest time, supply chain were going after efficiency and value, right? How can you get the most efficient supply chain with most value you can generate out of it? And unfortunately, that the counter impact of that is that you losing the efficiency. Yeah, you're focusing on that one solution. And one of the ways how companies build resiliency into their supply chains is around, that's the old same saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Yeah, as simple as it sounds, but that is one of the things that many companies are now finding themselves doing, is that they understand that they cannot procure all of the scope, all of the quantities from that one supplier, no matter how good that supply and how great the price is. Because when something happens, you want to be able to shift and acquire alternative sources. So building the alternative sources of supply, maybe it's a primary and secondary supplies, or maybe it's a supply that you're procuring right now 100%, but then you have a number of suppliers who are lined up, and you know that they can be sort of a way to mitigate if your prime supply is not there. And again, adjusting and looking at what are the risk profiles of different supplies. So sometimes, and we talked about this, the sort of offshore Asian supply chains come with this large logistical lag, and sometimes you may want to avoid this. So the whole trend with nearshoring is that you reducing that logistical lag and uncertainty around that by maybe compromising a bit of the value, but then you're building in the resiliency by having multiple options.
Oh, thank you. So Monash asked a question around the digital age and how disruption is constant. How can organizations prepare for key supply chain changes and gain competitive advantage?
Yeah, so the level of change and the pace of change will continue to accelerate. There's all the predictions are pointing in that direction. It's not me saying that, but I think it's a consensus amongst many experts in different fields. The digital age disruption, you can see this as a sort of threat, and again, unfortunately, some of the organizations see this as a threat, where you can actually see this as an opportunity. And I think that it can be daunting, it can be very challenging. But I think I'll share a couple of ideas that come to mind. So one is you need to just accept that the competencies and skill sets that will be required from professionals or supply chain professionals of the future will change. And the changes is that there will be a need for more sort of digital fluency, digital skills in it, and being able to sort of be adaptive to the change in the sort of the digital toolkit. That's one. I think the otherwise I would say, and I think there's no shame in doing this, is that you don't have to solve this alone, right? There are experts out there, and there are service providers and application providers who are there, and reaching to them and starting a conversation. Just starting the conversation sometimes is what you need. Understanding the landscape, understanding what's happening, understanding different solutions and different sort of trends which are coming into it. That is one of the simple ways how the companies can advance that. It's not necessarily that you have to have an IT guru or a digital guru in your own team, especially if you have a small team. But reaching out to companies who understand this actually can be a very, very simple solution and help you to start on that journey.
Yeah, Sasha, all these are such fantastic insights, and I think you've called out in our session today a lot of trends that we've been hearing and seeing across oil and gas industry. So I know that this has given a lot of people things to think about as they're looking at their own individual companies and how what we've shared today can be impactful. We are just about out of time for today. I wanted to just say thank you, Sasha, for your time and your insights. To all of you who joined our audience today, thank you. If questions come up after we close, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer your questions individually. And to learn more about GEP and what we're doing with our oil and gas clients, please do feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you again to everyone who joined, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.